should be up.
Cool. So we'll just
coming in to the room. So we'll start very soon now.
Okay, well, I think we'll start now, and more people might join. So today we have an ethics paper, which is a work in progress presented by two of our PhD researchers in the Institute of Ethics at the School of Theology, Philosophy and Music here in DCU. So they're going to discuss designer or bias in data in a paper called Seek and Ye Shall Find Bias, Ethical Issues in Social Science Research Employing Big Data. So I'd like to present this by Mohammed Hosseini and Mikhail Vicharek. Mikhail's going to present the paper, which will be recorded. You can ask questions in the Q&A, which we won't record. The questions will go into the Q&A button, and we'll ask questions then, which both authors will address after the paper. So on that, over to Michael.
Thanks, Vika. Happy to be here. As you said, we're going to present a paper discussing the ethical issues in social science research employing big data. And it's just an intersection of mine and Mohammed's research interests, as Mohammed is working on ethics of scientific authorship and research integrity, whereas I'm focusing on ethics of big data, and particular on self-tracking technologies, just such as Bitbits. And this is one of the examples that we use. And we decided to work together. Mohammed had this idea to start this cooperation, which began with us trying to ask the question and answer the question, okay, why should we care about social science and the use of big data in social scientific research? As you all know, there's more and more data processed every day. Any online functionality, many technologies that you use every day process big data, and they disclose a wealth of information about people and their behavior. So no wonder that it is of particular interest to any researchers who would like to try to get more insight into people's behavior and people's imagination, and as well as social customs and the shape of society. The thing is, though, that the existing frameworks, both for conducting research and for ethics of research, they focus on biomedical sciences. When you look at guidelines and when you look at regulations, they always have this idea that research is conducted in labs and working on predatory thresholds and dealing with very empirical studies. And we thought that, well, social science is a bit different than STEM disciplines, and it would be worth exploring the unique nature of it. Which all started with Mohammed's presentation exactly a year ago at UCD, where he just presented the early idea for this project. And in autumn, he reached out to me to join forces. And since then, we've been refining the idea, and we are currently finishing a draft that is still work in progress, needs a few more sections, but we are fairly happy with how it's been so far. That's why we want to discuss it here and ask you for your feedback, especially as it will be very helpful in us refining the work further. The main argument that is our starting point is that the social scientific research is unique in relation to other kinds of research, both in how it uses its data and what are the consequences of its research, as we will explore in the further slides. And the other thing that we observed is that there are no widely adopted frameworks for using big data in social scientific research, whereas specific institutions or specific countries might have their own frameworks and guidelines. There are no internationally agreed upon frameworks and that are universally binding, but also enforceable by existing institutions. The European Commission's Ethics in Social Science and Humanities document is maybe the first step towards that, but as we'll show, it does not contain it doesn't address all the issues that we have identified, and it's still not universally binding. Now, the unique thing about social scientific research and its consequences is that it has several aspects that are very pronounced in it, and they're way more pronounced than in its biomedical counterpart. The first thing, of course, is that it informs policy decisions, whereas it be the public opinion or the decisions made by politicians, they will often base that on the results of social scientific research. And we have to consider that when we design studies and when we communicate research results. The other thing closely connected to that is that it shapes how we view the everyday world in which we live and the shape of the society in which we inhabit. So the results have a very strong impact on our life. At the same time, it is vastly different than the STEM research employing big data, in that social scientific research, ever since its beginning, have always been interpretive in nature, be it because the input of the researchers is more pronounced and their worldviews are coloring the results of the study more evidently, but also the kinds of phenomena with which social scientific research deals are not simply empirically observable phenomena that have clear definitions, etc., because it is contentious what should be considered normal, and the way we describe the world in social scientific research is culturally based and also based in our language, which, as we know, is not always that as definite as we would like it to be. At the same time, this might also lead to the fact that the regulators do not give as much attention to social scientific research as they do to biomedical science. The kinds of studies that people conduct in biomedical science are always subject to ethical approval, which is not always the case in social scientific research. The devices used in biomedical sciences are certified by bodies, and the devices used in big data social scientific research are not certified by such bodies. So overall, there is much less regulatory scrutiny, which might also be because the potential harms that might be inflicted as a result of social scientific research are not as direct. We do not think about harming bodily integrity, for example, when people are getting a new drug that has negative side effects. We are talking about things that are much more difficult to predict and also much more difficult to pinpoint to a specific study, because the change in the social understanding of phenomena might be very gradual. But, for example, a study highlighting the connection between low income and crime might influence policymakers' decision and thus harm entire groups of people. So the ethical scrutiny on social scientific research should be there. To just give you a few examples of the big data research, social scientific research projects that we consider in our paper, that could be monitoring the connections between the user's level of activity and their self-reported mood by, for example, giving them data collection devices, asking them to count their steps and maybe kilometers run every day, and reporting their mood on a numerical scale and looking for inferences. Another thing would be to, as in the case of Cambridge Analytica, of which you may all have heard, is looking at people's online activity on social media sites, but also activity monitored by cookies, to try to guess their future political decisions, and even worse, try to influence those future political decisions. The researchers also commonly use administrative data, such as census data, to find correlations between, for example, income and divorce rates in specific groups. Then there are also large-scale surveys, as used, for example, in experimental philosophy, to see what are people's intuitions about knowledge and cultural phenomena. Once we have that covered, we decided to ask the question of where does the big data come from? How does it happen that the researcher gets access to a given data set and can use it later for the purposes of a study? We have basically two main categories that are used in big data social science research. One is reuse data sets. In this case, a researcher might take a publicly available data set, for example, administrative data, collected by a government or by a given company and made available, and use that, crunch it on a computer to find justification for the hypothesis. Similarly, they could use data that has already been generated for the purposes of another study and simply reuse it for their own study, as those data collected for the purpose of big data research often has a lot more information that is necessary for that for a given study and can be later reused. If a researcher gets access to such a treasure trove, then they could use the data collected by social media companies. So people's interactions on Facebook, Twitter, and other popular websites could give researchers a lot of insights into people's behavior and people's views. Similarly, the online activity that is tracked on most of the major websites, the cookies, if a researcher could get access to that, that would also give a wealth of information to be used in social science big data research. On the other hand, a researcher might decide to generate their own data set. And one way of doing that would be just to create a new big data set that would be later analyzed by a computer by using existing data, for example, written on papers or collecting data from hundreds or thousands of interviews, which is time consuming. Another example would be crowdsourcing platforms such as Mechanical Turk, Crowdflower, Clickworker, Toluna, which take people's responses to a given survey and collate them into a bigger set that is later usable by a researcher. And finally, they could use devices that are specifically designed for data collection, and this connects to my own research where data collected by smartphones and smartbands and smartwatches, other smart devices, can give us a lot of information about people's daily activity, for example. The two kinds of data sets that are used in big data research lead us to identify three kinds of challenges that need to be addressed when discussing ethical issues of big data research. The first one is connected to the reliability of data, which we discuss in its two aspects, one connecting to the reuse of data sets and the other connecting to the data sets that were generated for the purposes of the specific study. From there, we follow with some research integrity challenges and non-exhaustive list that is expanded upon in our paper. And finally, consider the interpretative nature of social science, as well as the prejudices of individual researchers. When it comes to reliability, the main thing to consider is that researchers potentially have no influence and no insight into how the data is collected, the methodology that's been used. For example, the census workers that created the administered data set later used in a study might have been not diligent in collecting their information. For example, they filled out some information that was missing from the responses, or maybe they just made up data just to look good. They actually went to people and asked them, which can happen. And the problem is that we have no idea if that happened and how to isolate such cases. Similarly, people responding to such surveys, such questionnaires, they might give false answers in fear of repercussions or fear of discrimination on the basis of their answers. For example, people lying about their income, or people lying about their legal status. Another problem that has to be considered is that in such cases where data set is found and reused, the data quality might not be up to standards of a given researchers, but it would be impossible to determine. Think of using data supplied by a company like Twitter and the nightmare that would be isolating the influence of social media bots. Whereas it might be possible to isolate some of those cases, there's so many interactions that are not genuine interactions, but interactions by actors that are trying to look like genuine actors, that would color the results of the research and the data set itself, and it's impossible to isolate them. Thirdly, the consent is a problematic question when we are reusing a data set. Even if we take a data set that was generated for the purposes of another studies, and the subjects were aware that their data will be used in research, is it the case with every future research, every future study that might be conducted on the basis of data? We argue that it is very difficult to expect research subjects to anticipate all the possible uses of their data. And as such, them giving informed consent to participating in a study based on a reused data set is very problematic. Similarly, even though the push for making datasets fair, that is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, is laudable and makes research much easier, as well as opening a wealth of knowledge to others, it would also make data accessible to malicious actors, which we discuss later in this presentation. And finally, there's a lot of discussion of anonymization that can protect individual peoples from harms directed specifically at them. But at the same time, we have to remember that, for example, policy decisions, they do not target individuals, but they target entire group of people. And if a research is unreliable and leads to certain conclusions, the discrimination are simply other kinds of harms against certain groups because belonging to, for example, minorities identified by the fact that they live in a certain postcode or that they have a certain income or certain level of education. Those policy decisions will influence people's life chances and might harm them, which is especially problematic if they are made on the basis of unreliable data. One answer to those problems would be to just say, okay, we know that reusing data sets has its problems. How about we just create new ones and eliminate those problems altogether? We discussed that as well, using self-tracking devices as a chief example and a paradigmatic example in our review. And the first problem with that is that, sure, those methods look very accurate, but they are not as accurate as they seem, because the developers, they market their devices as something that is objective and scientific, but in the end, those numbers are always inferences and not measurements. And even if they're measurements, the variability of those measurements can sometimes be problematic to the point where different users will get different results in the same sample, or even the same user might get different results in two different comparable samples, which is a problem. Similar technologies might be biased against specific users, and if they have any limitations, the companies rarely disclose them because they try to protect their commercial interests. For example, members of minority groups usually get skewed results compared to wide well of men, young men. This happens, for example, when women are trying to count their steps, because the movements that are best captured by self-tracking devices, they are movements that are most exhibited by men. And when women, for example, wear handbags, this influences how the step counters capture their activity, and as such, they will get less reliable results. And this has to be factored into when later using that data in a study. Another problem that the researchers do not account for in our experience and in the papers that we've read is that when such a device is used, or when a crowdsourcing platform is used, the researchers, true, they get access to the data that generated in this process, but at the same time, the developers of the technology are getting access to it as well. And as such, it is impossible to assure the participants that their data will not be used against them, and later maybe because this data later may be sold, as happens to third parties or advertising companies, for example, that will use it maybe to the detriment of the data subjects. Finally, we have to remember that as data is collected, it introduces certain problems, because translation of any kind of information into a data point is reductive and often will not capture contextual nuances. For example, true, my activity last month must have been lower than a year ago, but we have to factor that other relevant factors, for example, my injury history or the current situation around us, that limits my ability to walk around and seem productive for the device that I'm using. And what really caught our attention is that the ethical clearance is rarely required when using such devices, when generating data for the purposes of the study. Many institutions simply do not require their researchers to disclose that, and researchers themselves might not be aware that they are processing data of individual on a large scale, to which we will return at the end of this presentation. Other kinds of issues relate to research integrity. And the first thing we have to consider is the example of crowdsourcing platforms that illustrates how financial incentives and just conflicting interests of different parties involved in the creation of the data set might color the results and might color the shape of the data sets. For example, when you collect data on a platform like a Mechanical Turk, the users are usually given a small financial incentive for each survey completed or for each answer completed. This creates a behavioral way where it's in their best interest to answer as many questions as possible in as little time as possible, which really can lower the quality of the data that you are generating, and as such violate the integrity of your research. Another problem is that when you're using publicly available data sets, or when you are generating data for a purpose of the study, it's really impossible to guarantee that the research subjects are aware of all the consequences of the data gathering. Think about every time you click yes on a privacy policy or on a cookie disclaimer, and imagine now that all of that information that has been collected about you, that you might not even be aware of the fact that it was collected, will be later reused in a study. Technically, you click yes, but is it actually the kind of consent that we expect from researchers to obtain from the research subjects for research purposes? And finally, for the purpose of this presentation, what's interesting is that as data is collected by researchers, even for legitimate reasons, and even to the benefit of the users, the mere fact of this data being available and stored somewhere can make it accessible to malicious actors. For example, data collection devices might be hacked, or administrative data might be accessed for the purpose of identity fraud. Or people might plan burglaries by observing at which times specific individuals or specific types of individuals leave home for their daily walk or daily run and plan a burglary at that time. The third category of issues we've identified connects to the interpretability of big data. And there's no such thing as raw data that requires no interpretation. You always have to create meaning out of the numbers or out of the letters that you see on the screen. And this is particularly problematic when we consider that the prejudices of individual researchers, especially in such a malleable and sometimes unclear field of social science, they might influence the results of the research. For example, when we speak of normal kind of activity, or when we speak about subjects' race and subjects' religion, this might trigger some of the prejudices of the researchers and thus make them reach conclusions that are not warranted. Additionally, it has to be noted that all big data sets, they contain more data than is needed for the purposes of the research, including metadata and other kinds of information. This is particularly problematic as it might make researchers reach different conclusions than they would have otherwise. For example, if I'm studying the connection between people's income and divorce rates, as mentioned before, if I notice a correlation or a potential correlation also between their level of education or their ethnicity and their divorce rates, my prejudice might get triggered, and I might arrive at conclusions that are not warranted and that were not the initial idea for the study, and thus violate the research integrity. Moreover, it has to be observed, and we've seen some authors mentioning that people engaging in social scientific big data research often use methods and tools that were designed for the biomedical counterparts, which might not be problematic in itself, but there is a possibility that it will push the results of the research in a given direction, because naturally analyzing the social phenomena will require different methods and different tools than analyzing natural phenomena, and as such this has to be taken into consideration. Then we have to remember that it's not just about communicating research to the community of the researchers, who do have the ability, but not always, to actually interpret the data and read the results. But any research will later be disseminated to the policymaker, to the general public in the media, for example. And those people might not have the data literacy required to interpret the results in a way that the researchers would have intended, which can lead to another kind of problems. And in the end, let's just consider that a data set that is being used by given researchers might have been biased from the very start. As we said, it might have been collected unreliably, either by people who did not hold to their due diligence, or it might have been collected by a device that is flawed. Any prejudices exhibited by the researchers could exacerbate bias existing in the dataset already, and would make the research doubly problematic. This leaves us with a side note that Mohammed recently applied for research ethics approval, and he noticed that there are several questions that are asked in that process, even though he in the end did not have to, didn't answer yes to those questions. For example, one of those questions that you're being asked when you're seeking research ethics approval for a study is if you will engage in large-scale processing of personal data relating to living individuals. Now, the problem is that nobody can really tell what large-scale processing means. And at the beginning of the presentation, I did not define big data because it's particularly problematic. Even the document closely interested in large-scale data processing, that is the GDPR directive, it does not define what constitutes large scale. Here, DCU gives an example, over 100 individuals, but in the end, it might be to the discretion of the researcher to decide that what they're doing is large scale, or it has extensive or long-lasting effects, as in this question. Other questions go as follows, but what has to be noted is that the application deals mainly with individual harms. We are looking at the rights of individuals, which are usually protected by the means of anonymizations. But as we have noted, social scientific research is particularly interesting in the fact that it can target, its results can relate to the groups of individuals, and any harmful effects might also be effects that are harming the individuals as members of the groups. And we believe that framed as such, this research ethics application does not protect group membership of research subjects. Finally, since Mohammed did not have to go through the process of the DPI screening questionnaire and everything involved, it would be nice to have more clarity on how this looks if you answer yes, to give the researchers a chance to prepare and consider those questions before they even submit their studies for research approval. Because in the end, we argue that the existing frameworks, for example, as mentioned, the European Commission's frameworks, they do not address the ethical issues that arise when big data is used in social scientific research. The questions of bias and prejudice are not discussed at length in these documents, and also those documents are themselves not binding, and there are no regulatory bodies that are charged with enforcing those frameworks. In the end, all we have is we appeal to researchers' responsibility to conduct the research diligently and to not violate any principles. And in the end, it's just passing the responsibility to them. That should be more structurally assumed. And one of the goals of our paper is to provide some recommendations for international frameworks which should be developed and enforced to improve regulations related to the use of big data in social scientific research. This is also a call for more interdisciplinary research. Our paper, which is still being written and hopefully will be submitted in the near future, is just one step in making sure that the ethical issues of social scientific big data research are well known, identified, and addressed. Thank you very much for your attention, and I think this is the best time to move to the Q&A section. We hope that you've enjoyed the presentation and look forward to your feedback.
Thank you very much, Mikhail. That was a great presentation. It's extremely interesting.